So I've changed this slightly from raccontare la scienza to parlare la scienza, raccontare la storia. And yes, last week I'm in the middle of I was telling Giuseppe, I'm in the middle of a big family situation where we're moving house, and the man who came in to organize the removal of our furniture answered the phone and he said, "Pronto?" Except he said, "Hello." He said, "Hello, what's the story?" Have you heard that before? Hello, what's the story? That's a very common greeting in Ireland. Hello.
I think in some part, for example, in Tuscany, they would say "Dimmi."
Dimmi. Well, that's this greeting actually says something about story. And actually, there's a short version of it in parts of Dublin where you don't even say hello, you just say story. Kind of, have you got a story? You know? And I suppose that's a way into this, to say that stories are part of all social talk. And in science communication, there are various definitions, and I'll talk about this a bit more tomorrow with the master's students. But in recent years, Master Fabiola and I have been using the idea that science communication is social talk about science, or social conversation about science. And if stories are everywhere in social talk, well then we could maybe say science communication is society telling stories about science. And remember, society and science, and I'm sure Master Gianotti has said this to the master's students at least twice, science and society are not separate, one is inside the other. So stories are told by scientists about science and by citizens and others, and scientists are also citizens, of course, and by others also. I don't know if this is happening in Italian, but the word narrativa is being used to cover very many things. But in English, we have a tyranny currently of the word narrative. Every political debate, public debate about a political issue, you hear people talking about narrative. And it's a kind of synonym for argument, or case, or status quo even. It isn't really about the quality or the characteristics of the story that's being told. So this prevalence of the word narrative is somewhat misleading and possibly even a bit distorting. But when we talk about story in science, we're summarizing everything that's here under one. This is a typical list of the kinds of forms that science communication takes place in. And the list lengthens all the time. And that tells us something quite interesting and something quite important. But my reductionist version of all of that is that at the heart of all science communication is a story. Whatever format, whatever medium is used with whatever audience in mind and with whatever actors involved, at the heart of science communication is a story. And then we need to ask, well, what kinds of story? And in thinking about this, as I was in for a talk I gave earlier in the year, and then again more recently, I was reminded that a writer on science called Fred Jerome had written 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, about the stories in science. And I had to go and find what he had written just recently, like literally on Monday, I got it into my hand again. And the article or the essay he wrote had, this is Fred Jerome, I put his picture there just so you know he's an older person even than I am. And he's still alive, he's 79. And he wrote a really interesting essay in 1986 called Gee Whiz, Is That All There Is? Actually, there's a nice rhyme there. Gee whiz, is that all there is? But gee whiz, you know the term? No, see, that's interesting. It's actually out of date. The current term is wow. You do know that one, yeah? And gee whiz is a kind of slightly out of date way of saying wow. But gee whiz was kind of, imagine that. I'm amazed. Isn't that fantastic? And gee whiz stories were what Fred Jerome was saying were dominating popular science at the time in the 1980s. And in fact, he was saying that that was even the common story about science earlier, and that by the 1980s there was beginning to be a slight broadening of the spectrum of stories. And I would say that actually we're very much still dominated by, or not the loudest kind of science stories, let's put it that way. Not the most numerous, but the loudest stories are the wow stories, the gee whiz stories. You've learned a new piece of English tonight, gee whiz. It'll be absolutely useless to you, I have to tell you. Yeah. And a lot of stories, however, in radio, in popular culture, on social media, on YouTube, are wow stories about science. Imagine that. Amazing. What can they do? Incredible. You know, those kinds of stories. Estupendo in Spanish. You know. And I think that that's research. That could be researched. That could be demonstrated. And then we would have to reflect on that. You know, what's the implications of those wow stories being so strongly a part of the popular cultural image and representation of science. But there are other kinds of stories, as I hope to demonstrate in a moment. And that's basically the thrust of what I want to talk about. Is what's the range of possible stories, and what are the most common stories, and why are some more common than others? These are 4 headlines chosen to show one thing about science stories, and that is that many of them, and all of these particularly, are oriented to the future. So, what comes after the Higgs boson? Will we have greater innovation? What would the Large Hadron Collider do next? Etc. Yeah? The idea of something new and something oriented towards the future is another very strong part of stories about science. And also, another strong focus, and many of these things can go together, is on success and achievement. Now, most of you have never heard of this place, Wexford, but it's where I live in Ireland half the time. Small town, smaller than Trento, no university, and this is the local newspaper. And you can tell it's the local newspaper by the fact that it's got advertisements for paint and for insurance. You know, local, very much local advertising. And this man has been awarded a €1 million prize for work, as I hope you can see, in gene therapies to cure blindness. And it's clearly a story of success and of celebration. And as it happens, the prize is given by the Champalimau Foundation in Portugal, where, as it happens, I've also given a talk on issues a bit like this. But very interestingly, if you go right down the story, you find that no particular attention is drawn to this. But you find over here that his father, Tom, and his mother, Ursula, met when they were both students of a deaf school in Dublin, as in cannot hear. So not only is there a story that's an international success story, there is a story of personal achievement. It is quite an achievement for a deaf pair of parents to raise somebody in Ireland in the he must be about in his 40s, so in the 1960s, 70s. You can imagine that that's not an easy thing to do and ensure that they have a full education and go on to the highest levels of education. Indeed. So stories of triumph over adversity are also a part of the menu of science stories. Although here, the writer of the story has almost not seen the potential of it. By just mentioning it but not drawing attention to it. This is a dramatic version of the success story, where the scientist in question is described as a superhero. And most superheroes, fly like this and wear, Batman or whatever, Spider-Man outfits. And most of them are men, by the way. And here's the superhero, Lydia, a woman, and she's regarded as a superhero because she is the only Trinity College person speaking at this big conference that took place just 2 months ago in Dublin, but also that she has received a major research grant. And this appears in the student newspaper. And here's your superhero. I hope you all know her, Fabiola Gianotti. She is the Italian scientist probably with the highest position in the international scientific world. Currently, she's the director of CERN, where the Large Hadron Collider is based. And this was published in the Observer newspaper in England just before she took up the position. But again, there's something that I think is interesting here. So whereas Lydia Lynch is a superhero leading the charge, which is a very militaristic kind of image, she has basically Harry Potter powers. She has the key to the secrets of the universe. So you see, what this might be called by some people as a kind of a trope. The scientist as the unlocker of the mysteries of the universe, the scientist as hero, the scientist as triumphing over adversity. So this is one type of story which in the typology that I present to you in a few minutes, I refer to as the celebration story. And I think you can see that actually almost in the headlines, although this I think has other characteristics as well, which I hope have time to come back to. This is another kind of success story where a lot is claimed for science. We've had science now as unlocking the secrets of the universe in the previous one, and now we have science as the basis of economic achievement, economic success, economic competition. So two things are run together in the headline. Ireland has gone up the ladder, so if there is such a ladder, in terms of scientific research, and that represents a boost for the economy. Now, by the time you guys have finished the Masters in Science and Innovation, you will know how to ask questions of those kinds of stories. At least to know that they are capable of being questioned, that there isn't a linear connection between one and the other. But I'll leave that one to Massimiliano and his colleagues to discuss further. But there are lots of different kinds of stories that can be told about science. And on one day in October, I'm stuck in an airport and there happens to be a copy of the London Times sitting there, and I take one day's copy of the London Times, and there are all these stories that are about science, which is quite remarkable in itself, or at least it would be remarkable if you believed the story we used to be told, which is there's no science in the national newspapers, or there's not enough, or it's small, and so on. And in fact, that's not all of it, but that's what I could fit onto one slide. And you see different kinds of story, not just that some are about nutrition, and some are about medicine in general, and some are about life on Mars, but also that they are different in terms of how they appeal to the reader, what sort of affect they might have. I don't know if you can make the distinction in Italian between effect and affect. Something that's effective and something that's affective are two very different things. Just one letter in the difference, okay? But it doesn't work in Italian? Not quite.
Not in the same way.
Okay.
So maybe you can explain.
Well, affective is affecting you emotionally. Yeah, I am affected by something that moves me. Yeah, opera, except that I don't like opera. Jazz, yes. I'm affected by jazz. Whereas something has an effect on me is, you know, if a golf ball hits me on the side of the head, I fall over. And that happened to me. It wasn't pleasant. I don't recommend it. But do you see the difference? You're moved emotionally or you're affected in terms of, as an individual, or an earthquake happens in Trento and the effect is that the building shake. Yeah. So do you see the difference? And these stories have slightly different affects in terms of, for example, plastic particles found in human digestive systems. This is a very common theme at the moment. You may have seen the story about the whale. It had 6 kilograms of plastic inside it. It was just today in lots of media. Actually, think about that. 6 kilograms is a lot for a human. For a whale, it's not that much. I mean, I know I shouldn't say this, but actually when I was looking at this story and I was thinking, you know, the whale probably weighs 20,000 kilograms. 6 kilograms in that? Doesn't sound all that much, but I'm sure it wasn't very pleasant for the whale.
It was today on the Corriere della Sera and nothing.
It is all over the world, yeah. But I don't think anybody's asked the question. But tiny microns of plastic in our human digestive systems are significant. So that's one kind of story, which is a kind of a warning story, whereas the computer better than doctors is a kind of a promise story, hope story. Yeah, you see the differences there? So I've been trying to develop this thought about the different kinds of stories into a sort of set of categories, or what we call, or what in sociology might be called a typology, in which no one story probably precisely fits any single type, but nonetheless where we can make certain kinds of distinctions conceptually between one and the other. But just in terms of these stories, why are these stories, that one there on the front page, people who eat organic, 25% less likely to get cancer? Okay? Now, actually, if you read the story, it's a bit more complicated than that. It always is. It always is. Yeah, but you know, why is that there? It's because cancer is, you know, a human interest, a relevant story to just about everybody. I expect that just about everybody here has either a relative or has a friend who has a relative who has cancer. And if not now, that will be the case in 10 or 20 years' time. I mean, it's that sort of scale we're talking about. And that is why that kind of story finds its way onto the front page, because it refers to cancer. So what newspapers and radio stations and television stations and social media based platforms that are run professionally do is they select stories by certain criteria. And in the case of science, there are certain criteria that are specific, such as, I'm sorry about the noise from the microphone, I don't know if I can do anything about that. I could take my jacket off, but then I wouldn't have the microphone any longer, just myself. I'll just see if this works.
So you know.
One more experiment. No, this cannot be done by one person. Okay. We'll try. Science stories are chosen on the basis that that the science appears to be providing a solution to something, and I think you just saw that in those examples. That equally, they're chosen on the basis that they're pointing to a problem. Plastic particles found in human digestive system. Problem. Science stories are chosen on the basis that they link with other news. So the plastic particles stories obviously link with other news about the environment and about waste and about recycling, etc., and so on. And big science very often triumphs over other kinds of science and other kinds of stories. So this is the front page of the major newspaper in Barcelona 10 years ago. I've collected stories like this for 15 years, and when I was moving house, I had to move boxes up to here, so imagine each of this is a piece of box full of these stories, and I'm not quite sure why I did, but I didn't know how to get rid of them. So anyway, this is one of them. And this is in the front page alongside the story about Barca and Villarreal drawing 0-0, which is not great news for Barca fans. La ciencia abre la vía para crear vida artificial. You can understand all of that, yeah, quite easily. And it's based on this character, Craig Venter, who you may have heard of. He was the guy who ran a genome project privately in competition with the Human Genome Project that was funded by governments in US, UK, and Japan. And what this is saying is that the sequencing, the production of a synthetic artificial genome opens the way to artificial life. So you see the future orientation that I referred to earlier? Actually, all of these stories from 10 years ago should be revisited. What happened as a result of that? Do we have the artificial life that was being spoken about there? The answer is no. And there's more and more and more incrementally being done in along the same lines. However, the really stable, universal story is the story of discovery. And I didn't know that my collection of news cuttings spanned 70 years, but it does. So Dublin scientist solves a 30-year problem is 1947, and Irish scientists unveil secret of how bats defy aging process is 2018. And the illustration, of course, recommends this story for inclusion in the newspaper. I mean, that's a wonderful image of a bat hovering, which you have to wait a long time with very good lighting to get that picture. But over here, the Dublin scientist is actually from the next door country to here, Austria, Erwin Schrödinger, who lived in Dublin for 15 years when it wasn't comfortable to live in Austria. And he was giving a lecture in the 1940s in Dublin, saying he dealt with one of Einstein's questions around relativity and gravitation. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that the idea of scientists solving a problem or finding something out that solves some problem is a long-standing form of story about science. And when Massimiliano and his colleague Renato Mazzolini did a study of Corriere della Sera over a 40-year period, they found that about half of all of the science stories in that period from the 1960s to the 2000s were stories of discovery. And I suspect that if you ran the same analysis again, you would find the same thing. And you'll have to take my word for it, because I can't demonstrate it just now. but the discovery story in Italian, in Spanish, in French, in German, in English, in Swedish, looks very, very similar. Scientists in institution X have found Y, according to an article published today in journal Z. And more or less that form can be found in many languages in many countries. And scoperte, or how do you pronounce that word?
Scoperta.
Scoperte, sorry. Discoveries. The word discovery turns up in headlines. In this case, as it happens, both of them from space science and both recent. But here's one from 2009 in Dublin. And remember, Dublin scientist solves 30-year-old problem. Here we are, Trinity College scientific team. So science is made local. And I presume the local newspaper will give attention to Trentino science over Brescian science or Padovan science or Venetian science, I'm sure. But this actually is very close to what I was just describing. Scientists in Dublin who have found a new off switch for the immune system, the what? A discovery that could help lead to new treatments for diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis. Then it says researchers at Trinity College made the discovery and yesterday published their findings in the leading journal Nature Immunology. So what I gave you in one sentence here is in two sentences, with the addition of an element which is, I'll draw attention to now more in a moment. They found something that could lead to something else. Again, that's the future orientation that I was referring to, or the hope or promise orientation that I was referring to. La ciencia abra la via, etc., etc. You saw that earlier, okay? So this is a very well-known professor in Dublin. He's a professor of immunology. He appears on radio, he writes books, he does public talks. And he turns up again and again in the lab, holding up samples and celebrating more discoveries, more publications in big journals. And you see this? So they've discovered an off switch that could lead to new treatments. Here, 7 years later, they found a drug which could block several major diseases. It's in the same kind of very focused niche. It's about inflammation. As you can see there, drug stops trigger of inflammatory response. And this is actually also about inflammation, because rheumatoid arthritis is a form of inflammation. Yeah. So, not quite every week or every month, but every couple of months, there's another story comes out of that lab, which is saying more or less the same thing, except it's incremental and it's accumulating, and presumably, eventually, it will indeed lead to new treatments over possibly a 5, 10, or 15-year cycle. Now, for just a couple of minutes, I want to just run through some examples. I know you can't read the details of these. That's not really important. I think the headlines are probably giving you the information that you need to make sense of what kinds of stories these represent. So this I'd say, suggest to you, is a discovery story with elements of promise and celebration. So those are three types in my typology, and you've already seen celebration stories in what I've shown you. And so discovery stories have a vocabulary associated with them. Something has been found, something has been discovered, something has been shown, something is being claimed, something has been revealed, and it's revealed through evidence, through findings, through results, and it represents a breakthrough and it's been published, and so on. And these kinds of, this vocabulary, this quite limited lexicon, recurs again and again in similar forms. Here's a story of promise, and interestingly enough, it relates to the bat story about aging, and it's you know, again, it's there partly because of human interest. We all age. Some of us not so well, some of us a bit better, and some of us are quite happy to, and some of us would like to stop it. And there is a market for stopping aging, if there are drugs or treatments or cosmetics even. And so the dog could possibly provide a key. And the idea of the key, do you remember what about Fabiola Gianotti? About the key. So the idea of a key is a common one as well. And here's a story of promise, HIV vaccine after a breakthrough. And we just had the word breakthrough earlier as well. Now you're beginning to get the repetition, okay? And that's why I need to show you a few examples. Now this is a very strong promise story, published in 2011, saying that in 2 years there'll be a test for Alzheimer's for early detection and a cure in 10. Well, we're now in 2018 and that test still doesn't exist, although it is still being researched. It is a real thing, potentially at least. And the cure in 10 years, well, we've only got 3 years to go to the 10 years, and the chances of there being a cure for Alzheimer's in 3 years from now are 0, unfortunately. However, there is massive interest in stories like this, and there's a temptation, obviously, always on the part of popular media to overstate it. I have, or had, I mean, because many of them no longer working in radio, but friends who used to work in radio on magazine programs and chat programs, and they have told me from different sources at different times and different relation to different programs, whenever they had an expert on to talk about Alzheimer's, the telephone lines would be jammed. You understand, being jammed, you know, like blocked, with a number of people phoning in to find out what's the treatment. And even if the person isn't talking about treatment, what people want to hear is that there's any treatment. Because Alzheimer's, again, I could do the same thing as I did with cancer. Probably everybody in this room knows somebody who has dementia or knows somebody who knows somebody who has dementia, Alzheimer's dementia. And it's a desperate, desperate situation to be in, because at least with cancer there are therapies, not always effective. With Alzheimer's, there is not. And that's why these kinds of stories, you know, appeal at the affective level. You get that, the affect of that story. New blood screening gives hope to millions. So the newspaper is directly ramping up the affective quality of this story. I like animal stories, and I love this particular headline. It's very unusual, by the way, in English language journalism that a story appears as a news story with a question mark in the headline. But I'll show you another example in a moment. And this is a story of promise, but also what I call exposition, where simply the story sets out the state of the art, what is known and what is the work that's being done. And this frog from the Amazon basin, is it, or somewhere in South America, carried a certain substance on it, which potentially could be used in a compound to treat diabetes. I have made it my business to try and find this story, the follow-up, the sequel to this story, and the only example, or the only version of the story that I could find is this version. So the answer to diabetes apparently hasn't come from this frog, but the question is still being asked, is this frog the answer to diabetes? So promise stories use the words that I've already drawn your attention to, about hope, but also about, and they use these, what I call modal verbs. This could happen, this might happen, this can happen, and talk about the potential and so on in the near or more distant future. And I mentioned exposition as a type a moment ago. Here's something that isn't about a discovery, it's just an image. And it then tries to explain what the image is. And you have to take it on trust. None of us here in this room have got any way of saying, no, that's not what it says it is. Unless you're a professional astronomer. So this is the furthest cluster of galaxies from Earth. Okay. And it makes a pretty picture. But it sets out what's the state of the art. Here's a form of expedition which is the portrait. Not the portrait of a field of research or the portrait of an institution, but the portrait of a person. And this is an Irishman who studied at Trinity College Dublin, which you saw mentioned a moment ago, but who went to the States after he studied there and worked for a long time in the company Merck, as well as working in the public sector in universities. And he got the Nobel Prize in 2015 for work on a drug for the treatment of river blindness, which affects millions of people in particularly sub-Saharan Africa. It's a parasite that gets into the eye, and he's been working on treatments. And it's an interesting story, and he's holding up, apparently, the piece of cloth, I think, that contained the dissected frog that he worked on as a student. So one of the things that biology students have to do, and presumably still do, I don't know, is actually take a frog apart. You can actually see the nerves and the muscles really clearly just by removing the legs. I don't recommend that at home either, absolutely not, but it is something that's part of education, science education in universities. Then another type of story that relates to the one that we saw about the plastic particles, where the scientists or the science institutions or individual scientists are the source of warnings about something, or either damping down expectations or talking about risks. And that's very common in the medical area and in the environmental area in particular. Here's a celebration story. I had to include this because of the reference to cancer that we've already had, and a reference to cancer that I want to give you in a moment. The wonder drug that could kill all types of cancer. Well, again, that would be an interesting thing to follow up to see, has that actually led anywhere? I now have such a library of these things that I could be busy for the rest of my life trying to find out if any of these promises, any of these hopes, any of these expectations have actually been delivered on. Massimiliano and I had the privilege of hearing the man on the right talking about this discovery earlier in the year, and there's elements of discovery and celebration. And this particular discovery of a previously unknown early hominid was choreographed, we can say that, yeah? Brilliantly, so that at the same time as the scientific paper was being published, National Geographic were publicizing it, they having funded the research and so on. And the Prime Minister or the Deputy Prime Minister, forgotten, Deputy President of South Africa is present. So celebration is and commercial and political and scientific dimensions are woven into this presentation of the story all together. This is a very remarkable presentation of a popular newspaper in September of 2009. A new vaccine helps prevent HIV. Now, do you remember the previous one about the antibodies possibly leading to an HIV vaccine? This has been a long running saga about development of an HIV vaccine. This is called a historic milestone. It's going to change victims' lives, etc., etc. And this appeared in the Daily Star, which is very much as, you know, a football and racing, horse racing kind of newspaper. So it's quite unusual to find a full page given in this way to science-related stories. But here's the same story Okay, this is exactly the same release and announcement in one version and in another version in the Irish Times, where the scientists are excited. Now, actually, they don't look like they're very excited in that picture to me. Actually, and they're not even scientists. These two guys are actually senior executives of the pharmaceutical company which was funding the trial. So if that's a slightly, certainly the man on the left is not an excited scientist or an excited anything. And there's a much more moderated presentation of the story there, including a commentary from Dr. That's important, Maurice Houston, maybe you can see the doctor, so he's a medical correspondent, saying, whoa, the sample size may not be big enough to make these claims on, and while there's encouragement, we should not be celebrating yet. No such caution here, caution there. Okay, so what I'm drawing your attention to is that there is always a choice to be made as to how to frame, how to tell the story, which kind of story to tell based on the same piece of information. Just one or two more, because just pursuing the thing about the AIDS vaccine, so that was September 2009. 18 months earlier, The Independent in London, which no longer exists in paper form, had a very, very unusual front page with a question mark. Is it time to give up the search for an AIDS vaccine? And the question mark is, of course, the AIDS awareness ribbon, as I hope you recognize. And what the journalists did was they interviewed 25 scientists, medical scientists working in the field. Do you think there's any prospect that this, funding is going to deliver a vaccine? And there was mixed opinions, as you would expect, and they were then able to ask that question as to whether it is worth putting more money into that. And so that gives us a different kind of story of interrogation, a story of controversy, because people were expressing different opinions. So I've tried to put this all together. I'm not going to, don't expect you to read this. I'm quite happy to leave this with Massimiliano and Eliana if they want to share with you. I've tried to put this together as a kind of table showing the characteristics of these different kinds of story, exposition, discovery, promise. You've seen all of those, the kinds of words associated with them, and the ways in which they present science in different ways in which they present science as a place where something happens, or a place where ideas are generated, or a place where conflicts happen, and so on and so on. I've shown you celebration, I've shown you caution. There is also the opposite of caution, which is you thought that was bad, well then actually it isn't going to be quite that bad. So that's what I call the reassurance story. You just had a brief glimpse of the controversy stories. You've seen interrogation story, and I haven't had time to show you a speculation story, but these are very, very rare. These last two are the rarest types. And if I go back up, these are the most common with celebration. These are the ones that are most in the recent past, the present and near future. And then as you move along, there's more distance between the reader and the science, or the listener, or whatever the public is, and there's more questioning attitude. And here, you're looking out to the long future. So there's a time difference, a distance, sort of a personal difference, distance to the story, and so on, that differs between these various types. That's my attempt to try and give you a sense of the repertoire, of the menu, from which storytellers, be they in media or elsewhere, can and do select. Just a few remarks to close, if I can, quickly. What time, how far have we gone? Are we okay? Yeah, well, I mean, I should have said early on, and I'll now fill in that gap. The idea of science communication as storytelling has become very widely accepted. And in training of science communicators or training scientists to be public communicators, it's very common to say to them, and I was doing this just 2 weeks ago with graduate research students, what's the story? What story do you want to tell? Can you distill what you're doing in your PhD thesis into a story? And a story implies that it has some kind of progression in time. This is how I started. This is how I now reframe my question. This is where I think the problems are, and this is where I hope to be. Kind of. That's a story. Yeah. And so that's quite a common thing. And stories are taken very largely as being a good thing. But I hope you've got a sense from what I've been saying too, that there are also risks and pitfalls and dangers associated with stories. By simplifying stories and making stories powerfully affective, you may run the risk of distorting the information, or indeed distorting what we might call truth. Don't ask me to explain truth. And some stories achieve the status of myths. Mythi. Okay, myths. Very hard for an Irish person to say myths. But myths are very important things to all of us. Yeah, all of our cultures have their own myths. And some cultures have generated myths 2,000 years ago that we're still living with. Oedipus or whatever you are, having yourself from Greek classic background. And the notion that there might be myths in science, could there be? I mean, science is about rationality and about skepticism and so on. Well, some scientists have dared to suggest that even the notion of the scientific method, the, capital T, scientific, capital S, method, capital N, that has the status of a myth. That is to say, there is no one method that applies to all science. There are various applications of various methods, and in that sense, the scientific method becomes a myth. Peer review is one of the gold standards of science. And maybe there's a myth about that too. Because peer review is no guarantee of science that's published in peer-reviewed journals being valid, true, reliable, or even capable of replication. Various calculations have been done to suggest that over half of scientific research results reported in scientific journals cannot be replicated. But nobody's given the time to doing all of that, because why would they? Because the demand is for new stuff. Yeah? I mean, if you were to submit an article to a scientific journal saying, I have now replicated something that was published by Giuseppe Pellegrini in 2011, no chance, you know? If you were, however, to not prove that you couldn't replicate the work of a Nobel Prize winning scientist, that would be worth doing. You see the point, I hope. But there are myths in the history of science. And one of the ones you may have heard, one of the stories you may have heard in the history of science is how the Scottish medical researcher Alexander Fleming had asked his assistant, I can see some people nodding, and they know what's coming, asked his assistant to look after the samples while he was away on holidays, and there were samples of there were samples of bacteria in petri dishes, and I've got it now right, and he comes back from holidays and he notices that there are some petri dishes in which the bacteria haven't reproduced and multiplied, and there's a fungus on those, and that fungus then becomes the basis of penicillin. And the historians looking at that story say it wasn't like that. It was much more complicated. There were more people involved. There was more trial and error than just coming back from holidays, opening the cabinet, finding the petri dishes and saying, wow, look at that fungus, I've invented penicillin, I've discovered penicillin. So these kinds of histories, and we can in English use the plural of history. Massimiliano and I were just talking about this earlier, but these kinds of histories achieve sometimes mythical status. And there's now a small literature of critical examination of these kinds of stories in science, about the myth of scientific method, about Newton. You know, I mean, the Newton that Massimiliano has been writing about is a different one, a different part of him. You know the story. He sits under an apple tree, the apple falls, he says, oh, I've discovered gravity. You know, that's one of those myths. So the story about Alexander Fleming and the penicillin is unpicked by John Waller in Fabulous Science. In Hidden Histories of Science, there's some really great material which relates to what I'm talking about today. And there's one of the authors is Daniel Kevles, and he's writing about cancer in that book. And he writes, how scientists have come to comprehend what makes normal cells into cancerous cells is a strange story of difficulties, disappointments, and frustrations. Now, how many stories of difficulties, disappointments, and frustrations do I have in all those boxes? Very few. Very few. Maybe it needs a bit of historical distance to tell those stories, but several people have wondered whether it's not possible to tell those stories even in the present. What about this man we had earlier on who's holding up the dishes in the lab, talking about the breakthroughs in terms of drugs to treat inflammation? I know him personally. I don't write journalism any longer or write stories for public consumption much either any longer. But the story I would ask him now is, tell us about the blind alleys. Tell us about the wrong turns. Tell us about the mistakes that were made. Tell me about the things that you thought would work out that weren't realized. Tell us about the serendipitous connections that you were able to make. That story doesn't get told. And if it is told, it's certainly overwhelmed by the stories of celebration and discovery and promise and hope and so on. To tell those stories alongside the stories of discovery and promise wouldn't change the fact that science is a fantastically successful human enterprise, a fantastically important human enterprise. It would merely make it more credible that science achieves what it does achieve, and scientists achieve what they do achieve, if you could show the difficulties that they faced, the disappointments that they had, and the mistakes that they made. Or indeed, if you show that scientists as individuals are capable of being quite vulnerable, or domineering, or both simultaneously. So when we ask at the end of the day, when we meet our pals, what's the story? Hello, what's the story? We don't expect to be told everything went great. In fact, we don't want to be told they had a fantastic day where everything went well, because you start then being jealous of them. You actually want to hear the story about the things that didn't go so well. And when we tell stories about politics, we talk about successes and failures. When we tell stories about the economy and business, we talk about successes and failures. When we tell stories about sport, we talk about victories and losses. Ireland is now the best rugby team in the world and one of the worst football teams in Europe. All happened inside 2 days. We beat New Zealand on Saturday and couldn't score a goal for the 4th match in succession in European football on Monday. So we expect to hear about success and failure. And it is the failure that gives sense to the success. and it is the success that gives sense to the failure. So maybe that's a good reason why we should be telling a wider kind of variety of stories about science, in order that science can be more credibly situated in the everyday, not just as exciting and wow and awesome, but also sometimes messy and dirty. Thank you.